Welcome to National Park Stamp Quest, a show about stories we carry home from America's national parks, one stamp at a time. I'm Megha Anhalkar, a PhD chemist by training, and by profession I invest in biotech. But outside of work, my true love has always been America's national parks. The landscape, the wildlife, the people, and the history, and those small passport stamps that somehow hold entire memories. Each episode follows people, memories, histories, and quiet moments that make these places stay with us long after we leave. And for our very first episode, we'll start off with a larger question. We are not entering just one park today. We are stepping back to ask what national parks mean now. Who remembers them, who repairs them, and who carries responsibility for them forward. I am so honored to be joined by Charles F. Sams III, known to many as Chuck Sams. Chuck served as the 19th director of the National Park Services and was the first Native American to lead the agency. He is Cayuse and Waya and an enrolled member of the Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation. Across his career, Chuck has worked at the intersection of tribal leadership, conservation, public lands, natural resources, and stewardship. With Chuck, we'll explore parks as inherited places, places of beauty, of indigenous history, living communities, and long-standing stories. Chuck, welcome to National Park Stamp Quest. I am so honored to have you here.
Well, thank you, Megha. I'm very happy to join you today.
So before we begin the episode, I'd be very grateful if you'd like to introduce yourself to our listeners in the way that feels right to you. You know, whether it's people, places, and responsibilities that have shaped your work, or whether your history in life in general.
Thank you. Wanichalau and Ananyuma, in Ashwa Nashashkalashkrit, Iwa Yakanashnak Nui Tluma, the Chamna Nechiawe Pum. Iwalipu Walulupum, Yankton, Kokapa. Good day, my friends and relatives. My Indian name, my original name, is Mockingbird with Big Heart. My given name is Chuck Sams, and I come from the place of the Big Springs, which is located in what is now called Northeast Oregon on the Umatilla Indian Reservation. I am Cayuse, or Walitpu, people of the ryegrass. I am Walla Walla, Walulapum, people of the small rivers. I am Yankton, the people who live in the bend of a river. And I am Kokapa, which means the people who live on the clouds above a river. So as you can see, a lot of things to do with rivers and grasslands, and just understanding who I am as a person and a human being. And I spoke to you in the language of the Umatilla people.
That is lovely, especially because I don't know if I should say this out loud, but not a lot of people speak native languages as much anymore. I actually was talking to one of the writers called Mike Besimic, and he was telling me a lot of languages are lost. So I am so glad that you spoke to us in one of those.
I feel very grateful. I grew up with my mother's language first, Kokapa, and then living here on the Umatilla Indian Reservation as a child. In the 1970s, there was a resurgence of really wanting to teach language again. And so they taught us both Umatilla and the Nez Perce language where I lived here. And then I took French in high school. I took Russian when I worked in naval intelligence, and Persian Farsi. So I've been exposed to a lot of other different languages, which I think has also been very helpful.
That's amazing. You know, your heritage and your community and your land relationship has shaped so much of your career. But I'd love to know if there were incidents that you remember that made you even more closer to conservation or the land in general.
You know, I reflect back on being brought up here on the Umatilla Indian Reservation and the education that I received both from my paternal and maternal grandparents on understanding my place in the world. One of the things that I remember very early on is my grandfather taking us up every spring on the Umatilla River and its tributaries, whether that was Buckaroo Creek, Mission Creek, Esculpa Creek, Meacham Creek. And in the springtime, we would stop by the waterways, and, you know, it's snow runoff and water runoff, and we would build these little weirs, little dams out. My grandfather, and as a kid, any kid likes to build and stack rocks. But as I got older, I was understanding that we were doing this because the salmon were to return each spring, and we wanted to make sure that when they made their way up the river, that they could eddy out and rest as they went back to their spawning grounds. By the time I got into junior high school, I hadn't fully realized that salmon had been extinct on the Umatilla River and its tributaries for over 60 years. That they were lost to a little small check dam on the lower part of the Umatilla that the non-natives put in for irrigation. And so I asked my grandfather once I found that out, why are we doing this? And he said, because one day salmon are going to return, and we have a responsibility to ensure their return. And sure enough, I ended up, after I left the military service, working for a program called Salmon Corps, helping restore salmon in the Columbia River Basin. And in 1995, when I was 25 years old, salmon returned for the first time because we had to work around that dam into the Umatilla Basin. And I remember taking my grandfather out, and he said, see, I told you they were coming home. And that connection is how I know and understand my responsibilities to be a good steward of the environment. And that while man may alter their environment for their own fitting, we have to remember there's also the rights of nature to return back to their own homelands. And we as humans can correct that through science, through better understanding, and by having a relationship with flora, fauna, land, air, and water.
I have to say that's just such a sweet story. And the fact that your grandfather was so confident and sweet about it, like, look, it's returned. They've returned. I love it. You were the first Native American director of the NPS. I would love to ask about how your leadership style changed, or what kind of questions you asked, given your history with the land once you were at NPS, and what impact did you see at the beginning versus at the end of your tenure?
I would say that my leadership style hadn't changed. I believe in servant leadership. I believe it is my responsibility to be of service to those that I'm fortunate enough to work with and to work for. And when I arrived at the National Park Service, there was a lot of nervousness because I was an outsider. I wasn't a career National Park Service staff member. That was one. Two, that I would be bringing in my own ideas and trying to implement my own agenda completely was their next fear. And the National Park Service has ways of pushing back on that. But what I did is what I'd always been taught to do. I brought in every leader of every directorate in the National Park Service and had them spend an hour with me as soon as I joined the National Park Service to tell me what they were doing, what their priorities were, and what they were really hoping to work on during the next 4 years during the Biden-Harris administration. And from that information, I came up with 7 priorities, but those priorities aligned with a lot what the staff wanted to do. And then I had to look at seeing where the budget matched up with that, or where I needed to go back and ask both the secretary and the president for funding to support these areas of concentration, so that when we went to Congress for appropriations, they knew why the president was asking for that in his request to Congress for a budget. And so I think that took some of the staff by surprise, that the things I was laying out was mostly the work that they were doing, but how do we enhance it? And as I kept telling staff, whether you were line staff out in the field doing maintenance or interpretation, or whether you were part of the executive staff, my main job is to go out and find you all the necessary resources so that you can do your job well, and to implement and design policies and regulations that further support the Organic Act of 1916, and how we're responsible for protection of natural and cultural resources and ensuring these places are here for the enjoyment of the American people.
I know for a fact that you are one of those leaders who also visited a lot more sites within the national park systems. Is 163 the correct number?
133.
133. Okay.
In just over 3 years.
Wow. So before we go broader, I'd love to ask you this question. Was there a park site, whether a national park or otherwise, where it surprised you or is your personal favorite?
You know, I have a number of favorites. I would say the one that surprised me, from a kid who grew up in Northeast Oregon, you know, I love history and I read a lot of history. And I remember reading about the very early days of George Washington. And, you know, he had really tried to work to get a commission in the British Army, and he didn't get that. Instead, he ended up being in charge of volunteers. And one of the very first battles that he fought as a young 22-year-old was at Fort Necessity in the Pennsylvania territory at the time, colony. And it was the only major battle that he lost. But I'm from the West, where forts, when they built forts out in the West, they're really these huge, large forts with timber and four-sided and watchtowers and all of this. And I'd always wanted to go to Fort Necessity to see what it looked like. And we were taking a trip and driving up from Washington, D.C. To Cuyahoga National Park. And I asked my staff, let's stop off at Fort Necessity. And the staff there welcomed me, and they hadn't ever had a director at that historic site, which I thought was fun. But I was also surprised that that director hadn't stopped by before. And as we were walking down into this wetland, because he built a fort in the wetland, we come around the corner, and I'm looking at it, and it's this tiny little fort. I wouldn't even call it a fort. I would call it a timber that they stacked in a circle, and then they made a small little moat around as a defensive parapet. And the superintendent was looking at me, and he says, "Director, you look disappointed." I said, "I'm not disappointed. I come from the West, where I was thinking that this was going to be a big fort, like Fort Ticonderoga. And this is a tiny little fort." In my head, in the books that I read, I built this whole idea up, and now I'm standing here, and it's much smaller footprint. They did such a great job, though. The staff who were interpreting and the volunteers interpreted that battle and what it meant for the early colonies to lose that battle against the French Indians during the French Indian War. And they made it really come alive. And they made that story truly bigger than life itself, and how this set off what would eventually become the United States. And so I love to tell that story because it wasn't really disappointment. It was just shock for me as a little boy still inside, hoping for a big fort to play in, only to find this little tiny structure. But then to actually hear the story on the ground from the staff themselves and the passion by which they tell that story.
Absolutely. And I'm glad you picked that one, because when I typically ask this question, people say Yosemite or Yellowstone, right? They are grand and beautiful, and the wildlife. But I think a lot of people forget that there's so much history associated with many, many national park sites that we don't think of. I say that because I lived in Boston, and if you went to Quincy Market, where people now just go to eat chowder, you can get a stamp. It's a historical market, and no one knows of it. And I'm like, yeah, this is an NPS site, just so you know. So I'm glad you picked that one. And that leads me to my next question. Before a place becomes a national park or a national park site, it already has names and histories and communities attached to it, which means that it has responsibilities attached to it. When visitors enter a park today, what do you wish they understood about what there was before the boundary or the entrance sign or the visitor center?
I wish that they understood that this notion that the entire Western Hemisphere, North and South America, was just pure wilderness. It wasn't. People call wilderness that which is untamed, that's which isn't controlled in any way, that which isn't managed. And that's far from the truth. In North America, and what is just now the United States, the 2 billion acres that make up this country, not every tribe was an agricultural tribe. And there were over 2,000 different tribes across this country. But they were horticulturalists, which means that they managed the landscape. They did manage flora and fauna. They did manipulate rivers to meet their needs. They understood the importance, the use of fire as a tool to regenerate nitrogen back into the ground system for plants. And so I wish people, when they come into the park, don't really think of it as a wilderness area or that it was super wild in one way. This was a place that meant something to someone long before and for thousands of years. Most of our road systems, as we know, the highways that run all across the United States, weren't built out of thin air. Those are the original trade routes that tribes had been using for thousands of years before Europeans came into this continent. And so it's the same way that this land has been manipulated, as all humans do to their landscape, to fit the needs of the humans who lived here prior to.
I'm going to ask an off the script question because you specifically mentioned roadways. As a director of NPS, when you go to certain national parks, there are roadways very well built. Cuyahoga, as you mentioned, is a good one. There's a freeway running through it. Whether And then you go to Denali, for example, you can only go up to mile 45, even with the tour. I'm always curious, how are these roadways built within the national parks? Or even how you can go off trail in, say, Badlands or Theodore Roosevelt National Park, versus in some other parks, you have to be on trail. This is a question a lot of visitors ask and don't know about.
First, I'm going to start from the high level in that, National Park Service is responsible for over 5,000 miles of paved roadway, let alone ungraveled roadway or improved roads. And that is one of the largest deferred maintenance issues for the National Park Service, especially the paved roads, because the paved roads are what the American people and our guests expect to be able to go in on. And that costs a lot of money to maintain. That's one. Two, trails. The trail system is over 100,000 miles of trails throughout the national park system. And those are maintained by trail crews and volunteers. National Park Service is very, very fortunate to have over 250,000 people volunteer annually. And they work all kinds of services within the park, but a lot of them help with trail maintenance and trail clearing. And that takes a lot of work to do. And there are areas where you can go off trail in certain national parks. And the reason why is because the flora and fauna have not been overrun and they're still healthy enough that they will repair themselves if you go off trail. But there are certain areas in certain parks, and I think of the big ones like Grand Canyon, Yosemite, Yellowstone, who all have trails that have been overused, I would say, and people who've gone off trail and damaged flora and fauna that need help and recovery. And so I just try to remind people. Matter of fact, we were in Yosemite and somebody crossed through and I said very nicely to them, the staff work very hard here to rehabilitate this area. And when you go off trail, it just causes them to have to do more work. He's a young guy. He kind of huffed and puffed and he walked away. And my daughter said, Dad, he doesn't even know who you are. I'm like, it doesn't matter that he knows who I am.
I was just going to say, did you tell him who you were?
Of course, I said it doesn't matter about who I am. We all have a responsibility to remind each other to help protect these things that we've set aside for ourselves so that you and your children and your grandchildren will be able to be here to enjoy them.
Thank you for reminding that for everyone. Just last week, my friend Elizabeth and I were in Acadia, and they have boardwalks around the Jordan Pond for a reason. And a lot of people don't realize that if there are these outbuilt boardwalks where you can wait for letting the other people pass you, right? And some people don't do that. The moment you step off the boardwalk, you've killed something. Please don't do that. It takes millions of years to build that back. I'll come back on script now. But it was very funny your daughter said, did he know who you were? Because that was my first reaction. Did you tell him who you were?
And like nobody, no, I had to remind him. I went back to my regular personality. I'm just concerned citizen. Please be careful about where you're walking.
So we are recording this around 4th of July weekend, and as the country approaches its 250th anniversary, national parks are called the best idea that America has had. But they also hold some of America's hardest and most unfinished stories. At this moment, what do you think national parks can help America remember about itself?
I think more than anything, it is the most democratic thing about America, because every American, every citizen of this United States has equal ownership in these public lands, whether it's the national parks or national forests, Bureau of Land Management, National Parks, or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. These lands are ours together. And it's what makes us a democracy as a whole, because these lands that we've set aside for ourselves, especially national parks, that are here to protect both our natural and cultural resources and to be used for our enjoyment, our education, and our understanding, is an expression of that Declaration of Independence. It is that pursuit of happiness, and it is that pursuit of life and liberty together. You can enjoy that on public lands, and you can express and see yourself in public lands. When I joined the National Park Service, Secretary Holland said to me, we must ensure that every American sees a reflection of themselves in their national parks. Whether you've been here for as long as my people have been here for thousands of years, or you were just sworn in as a U.S. citizen yesterday and you start to build your own story in a national park, it's important that you see a reflection of yourself, because I think at the 4th of July, our national parks remind us of why democracy is important.
You have seen national park services from a vantage point very few people will ever do. Is there a park that sort of captures the tension? You mentioned it's democratic. However, do you see a park or a site where there's tension between the pride and the beauty or unfinished history um, all in one place?
Each of them, I think you can find some underlying tension or issue, whether that is the failure to recognize those who had lived there for thousands of years beforehand and what their contribution may have been to the landscape, or the folks that have not been raised to see themselves in the park yet. And we would give a great example. We just spent as a family a couple weeks before 4th of July, a week at Yosemite National Park. And I was very, very fortunate to go to that park with a former staff member, Yen Yen, and she was the park ranger interpretation there. She worked extremely hard to bring out the story of the Chinese American experience in the park. Many people don't know that long before it became a national park and it was a state park, that Chinese Americans had worked in there cooking food, doing laundry, helping folks who were staying both in the hotels and helping concessionaires. And they ended up then populating that area in and around Yosemite National Park. That Chinese American experience is an important part to uplift about not only the services they provide, but their own selves in the park and how they see themselves in the park and how they enjoy the park during their off hours. And she did a fantastic exhibit called the Chinese Laundry Exhibit. And it's still there. I'm happy to see that it's still there, but it tells the complexities of during a time period when we were excluding Chinese people from even immigrating into this country, and the people who stood their ground and held fast and were contributors to America and to the building of this park and to the recognition that, again, it belongs to all of us who call ourselves Americans.
I love that answer because a lot of visitors learn the story of the park through what the park teaches them itself, right? A sign or a ranger talk or an exhibit. This was a great example of how you can tell fuller stories. I'd love to know more about how you can not just tell fuller stories, but also more truthful stories, especially with indigenous histories, while still preserving the awe that brings people to the parks in the first place.
You absolutely can. I think that is one of the strengths of being a democracy, is that we know that this American experiment is going to have successes, trials and tribulations, and failures along the way. It's only a true failure if we don't learn from it. And we've learned over the years of looking at who's been excluded, who was excluded out of the Declaration of Independence, women. And they had to fight for their rights as suffrage to even get the vote, which took nearly 100 and almost 150 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. We look at the African American experience in slavery, and literally this nation was built on their backs, the industries, the agriculture, and their contributions and their pursuit to become free and equal under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Constitution. They are contributors to trying to form a more perfect union. You look in the modern times of the Americans with other abilities and the passing of the American Disabilities Act in 1990, and the importance of now, as when I was director of the National Park Service, that we were going to make sure that parks were more accessible for people with other abilities. What does that mean? It's looking at, do we have wheelchair accessible trails that are of greater length? Can other people with mobility issues be able to use electronic bikes or other mechanisms on the trail? Are we looking at the sculptures and making miniatures of them for people who may have lost their sight or were born without sight to be able to feel and touch them? All of these things had not been really thought about But we know in the National Park Service, we can help lean into that to ensure that everyone can not only just see themselves, but be part of the park and be able to learn and interact with the park, no matter who you are, what you are, where you come from, what abilities or disabilities you may have. I think that's an important factor that what parks can teach.
Personally, I'm very thankful for that. My mother has visited 32 or 33 different national parks. And over the years, getting older and having mobility issues, I've seen how she experiences park. But I have to tell you, Chuck, I'm so thankful for people like you and National Park Services because whether it was hiking in Yosemite 15 years ago or us going to Shenandoah last year, where we just drove around the Blue Ridge Parkway and her enjoying that, I think national parks have something to offer for everyone. And there are so many ways to enjoy it, learn about the history, and just be there. That very, very thankful for that.
I do too, and I think the staff really want to do that. Everywhere I was fortunate enough to travel in the National Park Service, I saw staff who were trying to make sure that everyone felt welcomed in the park, and if there was a way to accommodate anything somebody needed, that we would do so to the best of our ability.
A big shout out, especially to Shenandoah, because when I took my mom there for fall colors, the government shutdown was still on, but uh, the salaries of most rangers were covered because there was a Shenandoah Friends Only organization. I apologize, I forget the name, that helped them cover that. And the facilities were working, the lodge was working. And I was so thankful I could take my mother to Shenandoah for fall colors in my RAV4 and just drive around. Like she did not walk at all and had a blast for the weekend. And what a great park to visit in general.
Absolutely. I'm always amazed at the work that National Park Service staff do. They work together. They have great support through their friends of groups and the conservancies to support them in their work. And they're willing to do whatever they need to in order to make the park successful.
It's true passion and it's true stewardship towards saving something that we have and hopefully leaving it a better place than we found it. And I'd love to tap into that because most visitors experience park in short visits, right? Weekend, a hike, a photo, or something. But stewardship happens on a much longer clock. It- a ranger may give it a career, a tribal nation may carry the relationship with the land across generations. What changes when we think about parks in terms of generations rather than seasons? And how can we help be better stewards to take our national parks forward?
You hit on the word stewards and being a good steward. And what does stewardship mean to you as an individual? It's understanding that collectively we are responsible for these public lands. That yes, there are managers like the National Park Service or Bureau of Land Management or Fish and Wildlife Service, but we as American people also play a part in that. And so as we bring each generation, and I've done the same thing in the national parks that my parents took me to, I've taken to my own children to, so that they can develop their own relationship to that national park site, that national park in general. But I also want them to understand, that stewardship doesn't come free, and that we can help even in the smallest ways. Like when you are camping inside a national park, leave it better than you found it. If you see that there's trash on the ground, pick it up. And I've done that. We did that just recently, Yosemite. We were picking up other people's trash, and there's plenty of receptacles that people can pack it in or pack it out or find a receptacle. But it's just reminding that each of us has that obligation since we're all part owners. This is just like your house. You want to keep your house so that it lasts you a long time. We have to continue to instill stewardship in each generation so that these places will be here in perpetuity for those next generations.
And how do we get people from I was here to I am responsible for how I remember and protect this place?
If people do what they can. So if you can, as you just said, helping pick up trash or clean up an area, that's great. If you can donate to the National Parks Conservancy organizations or friends of, where your money is going to go back into the park to support that and the fees that are there. And most importantly, especially in recognition of the 4th of July and our 250th year as a country, is the recognition that our democracy is a contact sport. And by what I mean by that is you have to act. If you want these parks here for generation to generation, you can, as an individual, reach out to your member of Congress either by writing a letter or making a phone call about why you think it's important that parks are supported and receive the funding necessary so that your children, your grandchildren, those yet born will have that same experience that you had when you were in the national park. And that's much easier way. If you don't have any money, if you don't have the time to volunteer, you can always just write a letter or place a phone call.
That's a great tip, and even more so important now. I've been going to national parks for years, and I think post COVID, I see a lot more people visiting and enjoying being in these parks. And I'm sure it has affected how the parks function, that we should be doing better. I sound like I'm giving a sermon. I just love the parks. um, One last question on this. Is there a misconception about parks that you wish you could retire forever?
Is there a misconception about parks? Oh, yes, that all the parks charge fees. There are 433 national park units. Just over 30, less than 10%. 8% of all of the national park sites actually charge something, which is to say that, yes, I'm not trying to discourage you from going to Acadia, Rocky Mountain, Smoky, or anywhere else, but there are so much more smaller units that you can go out and enjoy. I remember taking a trip into the Ohio Valley and being able to hit 4 different sites inside of 3 days. And those are opportunities I think folks forget about. And looking at national heritage areas, many of our national heritage areas are interconnected with the Park Service, of course, and have partnerships with these smaller historical site units that you can actually hit 4 or 5 while on vacation and have a rich experience and a different experience in each one of those units. And so I encourage my fellow Americans and our international visitors, of course, go to the big iconic parks, but don't forget about the little ones who also you can have a fantastic experience in those units.
That's such a great myth busting answer. I never think of it because I have a national parks card, and every time I run out, I get a new one. Every October, you buy a new pass. So I've never thought about it. And you are right. Even the big ones are free. Isn't Smoky Mountains free, for example?
Smoky Mountains you can just drive right into.
Yeah. So, yeah, you guys can visit a lot more places than you think you can.
Absolutely. And the fees, we looked at the fee structure while I was there, and, the annual pass is extremely affordable. It is way less for an annual pass than it would cost you to go to Disneyland.
I don't know if I should say this out loud, but NPS can charge more. It was 85 the last I checked. That's like visiting 2 national parks a year. That's nothing.
Yes.
And it takes a whole car in. So 4 or 5 people go on that annual pass, which just costs $85.
And we looked at that, and we've had a lot of debate because people think that that's relatively high. And I say, no, it's a pretty good deal. And the staff really have advocated to try to make sure that it's affordable, that every American can be able to afford an annual pass if they wish to.
Man, I sounded like brat when I said you could charge more now. But good to know. And guys, you can buy the annual pass from either one of the national parks or just online as well.
Yes.
Chuck, I'd love to ask you a little more about the human side, the lighter side. During your tenure, was there a moment in the park that surprised you or moved you or made you laugh?
Oh, I had so many of them. And it happened to us while we were at Yosemite. It happened to the superintendent, which also happened to me, and we had to laugh. I remember one day I was in uniform with my flat hat, and we were touring the National Mall and looking at different projects and sites and what could we improve. And we're standing near the reflecting pool, and towards the Washington Monument. And I'm talking with 5 other rangers, the superintendent, deputy superintendent, and some interpretation staff. And this young woman holding her young child comes walking in the middle of us, and she's looking around, and she locks eyes with me because I was the last one speaking. And I can see in her head, she's assuming that I must be the most senior person there because I was the last one speaking. And she immediately says, "Hey, Ranger, could you point to me or tell me where the bathroom is?" And I said, "Absolutely." And I pointed her back to the Lincoln Memorial where there are public restrooms and the one other spot across by the reflecting pool that had public restrooms. And everybody kind of laughed and she kind of looked uncomfortable. And I said, "Is there anything else I could help you with?" And she said, "No, that was just my question." And she walked away.
So she didn't take an autograph the way Kai did on his passport?
Nope, nor did she ask for a picture. She just wanted to know where the bathrooms were. And I understood that. And the staff said, "And you did the perfect ranger point exactly the direction you want somebody to walk." And so when we were at Yosemite a few weeks ago, we were walking through the big meadow with the superintendent and talking, and the superintendent was talking about some of the new work that they had done in the meadow for natural resource protection. And here come a gentleman, and he says, "I'm sorry to disturb you all. I'm sorry, Ranger, could you tell me where the bathrooms are?" And the superintendent didn't miss a beat. He turned around and he pointed in the direction where the closest bathrooms were, and told him which trail he needed to walk to, and that it was about 150 yards from where we were standing. And I couldn't help but laugh as the gentleman was leaving. And the superintendent said, "What's so funny?" And I said, "I just love that it's egalitarian. Our uniform, every ranger looks exactly the same, and people have their requests, but the number one request usually is, where's the bathroom?"
I love that. Is there any other visitor incident beyond bathrooms or rituals that have stayed with you when you observed people coming into parks, especially visitor centers? Because it's like a thing, right? Everyone's looking to stamp their passports and buy magnets and stuff.
Well, I've had a number of them, people who did know who I was, and their nervousness to come up and ask for pictures. And so I have pictures both with staff and with visitors from all around the country. And I've had to tell my own adult children, years down the road, probably when I'm gone, somebody's going to walk up to you either with their cell phone or something and say, "I got a picture with your dad once." Please be nice to them. I don't remember who they are. You don't need to remember who they are. Just be nice that they showed you a picture of me.
That is so nice. I will say this. I recorded my episode with Kai, and when I mentioned it to you, you remembered him. So you definitely have good memory, Chuck.
I generally I think I do. I'm hopefully will keep that memory. I may not always remember a name, but I'll remember who the last conversation I had with somebody and what we talked about. So one of my other favorite stories actually was before I was a National Park Service director, when a group of sailors, my shipmates and I, had visited Gettysburg, and we wanted to see Antietam. But we'd stayed too long at Gettysburg the day, and the staff there were great, the interpreters, and talking about the battle at Gettysburg. But we said we had to run to get to Antietam. And as we did, we pulled in near the National Cemetery there, and there are these beautiful wrought iron gates into that National Cemetery. And there are 5,000 Union soldiers that are buried there. As we walked through, a gentleman was looking at something. He turns around, stands up, and he had a green and gray uniform, and he asked what we were doing. And we told him that we'd come here to a tour and wanted to look around. And he said, "Well, it's 5 p.m. I have to shut those iron gates at 6 p.m. sharp. Now you can drive around the rest of the park, but staff won't be available." And we said, "Okay." And he asked us what we did, and we told him that we were in the Navy. And he was kind enough to walk us around and talk about the different regiments that had served at the battle and where they were buried in the park. And then he took us at the far edge, and we jumped over the rock stone wall, and we were near Burnside Bridge. And he went into great detail talking about the Battle of Burnside Bridge, about these two best friends who had went to West Point together and ended up fighting each other at that battle. And the Southern gentleman had been married to his friend from the North, sister. Well, they did meet each other in battle, and the Northern captain was wounded while trying to cross Burnside Bridge. And he was brought up with his mortal wounds into the command post of his friend who was fighting for the South. and he realized that he was dying. And he says the last words he told his friend is, "Tell my sister I hold no grudge. I hold no animus towards you." And we're sitting there, and I was like, wow, that was a deep story. And then he jumps up and he goes, "Hey, boys, we got to go. We got less than 10 minutes. And we ran back up the hill. We jump over this stone fence, and he escorted us right out that gate. And right at 6 o'clock, sure enough, he shut it and made sure that it was locked. It wasn't until years later that I didn't fully understand National Park Service uniforms. He was not an interpretive ranger. He didn't have a ranger badge. He had a maintenance tag. He was a maintenance support staff.
Oh, wow. And he gave you such a nice story and
He gave
experience.
in deep experience and story. And I say that because when I was director, no matter what park I went into, what unit I went into, I met not only the interpretive ranger staff, the natural resource staff, but I met people who do accounting, who do administrative processing of permits, who do maintenance, who do plumbing, who do lawn care. Everyone in the park knows the stories in that park, and they're willing to spend the time with you as a visitor to express what those stories mean to them and interpret for you and help you have a good experience inside the park. And that's what's always impressed me about the rangers and the staff of the National Park Service, of how much when they get to a park, they love their park and that they're willing to share what they know about the park with you.
I was at Isle Royale recently, and they have seasonal rangers. The parks, I think it's one of the only parks that shuts down completely in the winters, and makes sense. They are like almost Canada. They're that
Yes.
north. But this guy had his major was economics, and he was a ranger. And I was like, this is beautiful. So you can come from many different backgrounds. You don't have to be an environmental scientist of some sort to work there. And I'd love to ask you, for people who think that they'd want to be a ranger or be involved with NPS, what advice can you give them?
You know, with so much changes in this administration, it's a little tougher. We had a very defined periods when we recruited, especially for seasonal rangers. But even as late as 2 weeks ago, seasonal rangers were still coming on board for the summer months, and summer's already started. So it used to be that you would start looking for openings on USA Jobs starting in October. Applications would be due by December. Decisions would be made by February, no later than March, so that you would know what park you were going to. Those timeframes have kind of changed. I think they'll get back in order soon, as we know the need of the parks, especially with seasonal rangers and the commitments that the government needs to make to hire those folks. But I say look for those opportunities early on and be prepared to have your resume and jump on it to be able to get into park to be a seasonal ranger if you want to do that. I've talked to a number of folks that I know who were seasonal rangers when they were younger, and they have careers in government, in natural resource work, and other places as attorneys in the business sector. But all of them reflect on their experiences of being a seasonal ranger during their college years or their graduate years, or during the years when they were just looking for work to do during the season. And all of them say those are so formative to them and to their understanding of being able not only to interact with other staff, but with the diversity that is America in the parks, and get a better understanding of their fellow Americans.
Absolutely. I don't do science for a living anymore, but someday I hope I can go back, if possible, as a national park scientist and study the plants. That would be my passion. Or maybe retire as a farmer, but mostly go in the national park services and do something, because there is so much that goes on behind the scenes beyond just the interpretive rangers that we meet at the visitor centers, that people don't really realize. To keep the parks running, it's supremely difficult. And I say that because we've had conversations. I have ranger friends, and it's just the requirements of the job are many, many, many different things than just saying hello and here's the toilet or here's your stamp.
Absolutely. The unsung heroes to me are the people who are responsible for potable water, to ensuring that the bathrooms are clean and upkept, that somebody is maintaining the trail so that it's a safe walk for you. These are people you may never see. But they're the people out there each and every day doing that job quietly, so that people have a good experience in the park. But they don't get a whole lot of glory. And some of them have lost their jobs as of late, but I think that will bounce back as we realize how important they are to running a good park and a good site.
I say that especially because a lot of parks won't even open without these unsung heroes, right? Glacier wouldn't clear up the road going to the Sun Road
Right.
for the
Yeah.
visitors go unless these people work.
And not only do they work, but they are very ingenious in the way in figuring out problem solving. One of the issues that I faced as director and we worked on it was our snow, and because you said like glacier, our snow removal equipment is not from one particular company. And so some of our snow equipment came from Scandinavian countries, some comes from the United States. And so it was hard to find the replacement parts or parts, those companies no longer exist. And the ingenuity of those staff to fabricate parts in order to make their equipment work in their park always amazed me of their just can-do spirit. We will figure out how to fix this. We will figure out how to make it work because we've got to open that road and we know that people want to come here.
It's problem solving at its best.
It is absolutely problem solving at its best.
All right. Quite sadly, I am at my last question, but my favorite one, Chuck. What is your stamp moment? Which is your favorite national park or a literal stamp that you carry that has stayed with you forever now?
I actually have two favorite national park sites. My first one is really Fort Pulaski in Florida, just outside of Savannah, Tybee Island. And the reason why is it was another one of those that I'd been to very early on in my Navy career. And I was there with some friends. And it was the story that they tell of how the fort was built in the 1850s. And sadly, it was built by slave labor. But what caught my attention was when we were in a casement and the ranger took his flashlight and he showed me and he says, "What do you see there?" And I saw these little indents. And he goes, "You can put your fingers in there." And I realized they were children's fingers. And he told me how the slave labor was even children and that they had them putting these bricks while they were still hot. And then they do a great interpretation of the Civil War battle that happened at Fort Pulaski. But it's also just a reminder that we don't back away from those hard stories to tell. He didn't back away from it. He told it and where it was. And it's a good reminder of why we don't do these things anymore and why it's important that we have to form that better and stronger union of the American experiment. That's one. And when my children were old enough, I took them there and wanted them to see that and experience it so that they understood we tell the hard stories. We don't shy away from them. And that makes us stronger and better by having this knowledge. And then, I would say Grand Tetons is my favorite national park. Again, though, also I took my children there when they were young, but I'd been there before as a young man. And waking up each morning and having your tent door face the Grand Tetons is quite amazing as the sun's coming up from behind you and just they're shining on those mountains. And then the sun sets as it goes over the mountains, being on Jenny Lake. And the flora and fauna you see there, the elk, the bears, you can just get it all in, and bison even at Grand Tetons. It's just, to me, it's always breathtaking, and I always look forward to spending time there.
I love that answer because Grand Tetons are my favorite as well. I have had some friends tell me they went to Yellowstone and didn't go to the Tetons, and I was like, what? I think
Yes.
Yellowstone is great, but personally, I think it's a little over indexed for me. It's beautiful. I do like Yellowstone, but I had a much better experience hiking and just, we saw bears and moose and like all sorts of wildlife in Grand Tetons. I'm like, it's literally 30 minutes away. You could have gone for a day and you didn't. So I'm glad you said that one.
I still remember my son running back on this trail, and there was a little a pond down below and this wetland, and he's being quiet. I said, "What are you being quiet for?" He goes, there is a moose down there with her calf. And we were high enough and far enough away that we could see them both. And just their awe of watching this calf and its mother drinking water and work their way around. You have absolute magical moments at Grand Teton National Park.
Is there one that you dislike? Am I allowed to ask you that question?
I've not found a national park site that I dislike. Because the it takes a lot to make a national park unit. The second fallacy you asked me, what do people think that happens that doesn't happen? The National Park Service doesn't create national parks or national park sites. That's not our job. Matter of fact, we're pretty much banned from doing so. Now we have to have Congress act to have us do an assessment of a site that a community has brought to them for us to look at, and we can make recommendations about suitability, feasibility, what does that mean, and we report to Congress. Congress makes the decision about what becomes a National Park Service unit. And once they've passed that, because so each unit is unique because it's passed through law for its designation by Congress. So a lot of people think National Park Service creates parks. We don't create parks. The American people make that decision. And so when you ask which one's the least favorite, what to me is what I'll enjoy in the smaller units is finding out why a group of Americans and community got around and convinced their members of Congress that this particular site must be set aside for all Americans to enjoy, whether it's for historical, cultural, or natural resource reasons. And that part I always find the most interesting part of the story of, so why did this become a site? Who decided that this should become a site? And how did they get Congress to back them to make it a site?
I love that answer because I don't know if I should say this out loud, but I am sure the state of Missouri is going to ban me because I always say my least favorite is Gateway Arch. And I am sure it has fantastic history. And I am hopeful I will find someone to tell me on the podcast someday. But that's my least favorite. I put it at number 63 in my ranking. And it was a pit stop for me, Chuck. I had a long layover. I went out, got my stamp, got my picture, walked around a little bit, and then I was done.
Well, we, on our last trip to Yosemite, even we joked about, if we love Yosemite, but if we were to give a flippant review of Yosemite National Park, what would it be? And my wife and my daughter and I were sitting there, and of course, it does get pretty crowded down there. And I said, so what would the Sam's Family review of Yosemite National Park be? And we would come up, never-ending winding roads to an overcrowded valley floor to look at half a rock.
But that is true. It is half a rock.
That's what she said, because I'm like, what? And she goes, half dome. It's half the rock. And I was like, oh my gosh, you're funny.
Yeah, no, I am really worried. This podcast is going to be the last straw and the state is just going to ban me. I can't even fly over it. So I'm always like, why is that a national park? It shouldn't be one.
Did you go up on the arch?
I did.
And that was, I found it very interesting because I'm like, I didn't realize you could go. I'd been there before and I'd walked around, but I didn't know you could actually go up.
Yeah. And it has decent views and the rangers there will do a great job of interpreting the history but it's the smallest one and
yes, it is.
And I don't know if I should say this, but even the history is just okay. So, I need to shut up. I vote for White Mountains to be the next national parks or lava beds in California. I love those two sites. If I could lobby, they'd be my next.
You just got to get the community behind it.
I know. Maybe that's what I'll do. Next summer, I'm going to rally, Chuck. Maybe
Very
come
good.
to you for your signature. They are beautiful parks, I promise you.
Well, I've been to both, and I do agree. They are beautiful sites.
Yeah. Chuck, you've had an illustrious career so far, and you are still in the field of conservation and doing your bit. We'd love our listeners to know what you're doing next. I know you're involved with Yale, so someday I hope we can get pizza together in New Haven.
That would be wonderful. I am very fortunate to both be faculty and staff at Yale, working at the Yale Center for Environmental Justice as Indigenous Programs Director and lecturing at the Environmental School. I'm also scholar in residence at the University of Oregon, where I'm working on a law paper around the original laws that Native people were given around stewardship. But it has given me a chance as I left the National Park Service. Most of my career, I've been given the title either conservationist or environmentalist. I don't really think those fit for the paradigm that I come from. I think that I'm more an advocate for abundance because I grew up under the paradigm that believed that I had limited wants. I needed food, shelter, warmth of a fire, and love of family and water. And I have an abundance of those and was taught that I have an unlimited supply of that. Of course, you can imagine my shock when I went to business school and found out that I actually was supposed to have the opposite, that I was supposed to have unlimited wants with limited resources. And so that never made a whole lot of sense to me. And what I really want to advocate for and what I really want to work on is being the advocate of abundance, which is to say that looking about the rights of nature and a river's right to flow freely, the right of air to be clean and not polluted, the right of flora and fauna to not have to fight for their survival from extinction or planned extinction. What can we do better as human beings in our natural world to be those advocates for abundance? Because we all rely on those things. We all want cool, clean water. We all want to ensure that there are flora and fauna of abundance that provide, as you know, medicines that we derive plants from, animals that we're relying on for not only just food sources, but other supplies, and their importance in ecosystem function to manage in a way that supports the natural world. That's what I want to do. I want to spend my time being that advocate for abundance.
That is such a great answer, Chuck. Thank you so much for joining us today. It was such a fun chat, not only about national parks and fun stories, but also thinking about parks beyond our visit and how we can leave them in a better place than we found them. I truly hope this podcast motivates people to go out and do their bit and also recreate responsibly because it is, as I always say, every park has something to offer for everyone who visits.
Absolutely. Even Arch.
Yeah. Yes. If I get banned, you will be the first person I email. I am really scared. You're laughing, but I'm really scared because I've given this opinion quite openly and it's not going to go down well. I am sure at least a ranger or two from there is going to email me and be like, you're never welcome. I still have about 8 national parks that I'm left to visit, but I doubt anything's going to dethrone that one as my least favorite. We'll see.
Well, you know what? Parks grow and change. And I'll give an example. I went to Custer's Battlefield when I was young and little because I have family in Montana, and now it's Little Bighorn. And so it has changed. And I would say my younger self did not like the way they told the story. My adult self, it tells a more complete story. So just as the United States, we pursue life, liberty, and happiness, and we are willing to change, so are the national parks. And maybe one day, Arches National Park will be able to bring a story that you really want to hunger for.
Oh my God, I feel so bad for saying that out loud now.
It is perfectly fine.
All right, guys, that was Chuck Sams, former director of National Park Services, helping us begin the National Park Stamp Quest with a bigger question. Not only where we go, but what we inherit when we arrive. At National Park Stamp Quest, every stamp marks more than just a stop on the map. It marks a moment, a memory, and sometimes a responsibility. Keep your passports close and your stories closer. Until next time, I'm Megha Anelkar, and thank you for listening.